The marmalade jar had been opened with a penknife. That was the detail. Mrs. Lavinia Creswell never used a penknife at breakfast. She disliked blades near the butter dish, and had said so for 20 years. Yet the paper seal had been lifted cleanly, folded twice, and laid beside the plate as neatly as a bill in a solicitor's office. The toast had been buttered before the marmalade was spread. She would not have done that either. Lavinia Creswell thought butter with Seville orange marmalade a barbarism. Someone had prepared her breakfast for her, and in that house, kindness was rarely the simplest explanation. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. Tonight's case takes us to a frost-bright St. Mary Mead, where parish trifles, orange peel, and breakfast habits conceal a most deliberate malice. This is Marmalade, Mischief Murder. Chapter 1. Due in St. Mary Mead, January possessed a curious quality of making everything appear both cleaner and more secretive than it really was. The hedges stood black and clipped against a pale sky. Gravel rang underfoot. Smoke went up in narrow, respectable columns from cottage chimneys, and one saw old ladies at their gates in stout shoes and woolen gloves, as though they had merely stepped out for air, when in fact they were collecting information. Miss Marple, seated by the drawing-room window at Danemead with a strip of pale grey knitting over her fingers, looked out upon her garden, and reflected that winter was the true season of human nature. Summer covered things with roses. Winter showed the shape of them. Her maid had brought in the post and the morning paper. There was, besides, a note from Mrs. Bantry, who scribbled largely and with impatience, "Come at once after luncheon if you can. St. Mary Mead is being childish, and I dislike it. Dolly." Miss Marple smiled faintly. St. Mary Mead was quite often childish. It was one of the least childlike places in England. By 2:30 she was walking, lightly and neatly, up the drive to Gossington Hall. There had been a hard frost in the night, and the grass by the shrubberies still glittered in the shadow. Dolly Bantry received her in the morning room with an energy which had not diminished in the least through the years. "My dear Jane, the whole village is behaving like a nursery left to itself. Tea at once. I shall be unbearable if I do not speak." Colonel Bantry looked up from behind the Times and grunted amiably. "It began," said Dolly, pouring out, "into with the preserve labels at the Bazaar Committee." Lavinia Creswell had arranged them in rows upon the long table in the schoolroom. Seville orange, thick cut. Seville orange, fine cut. Lemon curd, which is not a preserve, and I said so. Crabapple jelly, all very proper. And when we came back after church, every single label had been exchanged. Miss Marple accepted tea and a thin slice of seed cake. Exchanged how? Oh, absurdly. Marmalade upon the mint jelly, gooseberry upon the quince, and Lavinia's prize Seville orange marked as onion chutney. She nearly had a seizure of righteousness. Colonel Bantry chuckled. The thing was infernally funny. It was not funny at all, Henry. It was silly. Then the vicar's hymn board was altered before evensong, so that we all stood up for Fight the Good Fight, and found ourselves expected to sing The Day Thou Gavest. Yesterday, Mrs. Price Ridley discovered a string of orange peel tied in bows along her garden gate. Orange peel, Jane. Miss Marple stirred her tea. How very curious. That is what I said. One prank, perhaps. Two, if boys are at large. But all week it has gone on. Miss Hartnell's market basket hidden in the tool shed, the key of the parish cupboard in the sugar bowl, and this morning a plate of marmalade sandwiches left on the vicarage step, with the crusts cut off like nursery food. Colonel Bantry lowered his paper. It sounds to me remarkably like boys." "There are no boys of the right kind available," said Dolly briskly. "Jimmy Weatherby has influenza. The curate's nephews went back to school on Monday. And if you tell me girls did it, I shall throw the milk jug at you, because girls are worse." Miss Marple's blue eyes rested thoughtfully on the fire. "Mischief," she said gently, "is not always done for amusement. Some people are very fond of calling malice by a lighter name." Dolly pointed with the teapot. "That is exactly why I sent for you, because everyone says it is only nonsense, and yet one does not care for it, not in January, not with Lavinia in one of her governing moods." Mrs. Lavinia Creswell lived at Ferny Court, a square red-brick house a little beyond the church, with a still room that was famous in 3 counties, and a temper which had been famous rather longer. She had been a widow for 18 years, was rich in a dry, carefully audited way, and made Seville orange marmalade of such authority that women who disliked her still copied her method. She chaired committees, corrected grammar, supported the church when the church behaved properly, and had never been known to forget either a slight or a recipe. "Is she very much disturbed?" asked Miss Marple. "Furious rather than frightened," said Dolly. "She says somebody is trying to make St. Mary mead look common. Cecily Harbottle told me Lavinia has counted her jars twice this week." "Miss Harbottle is still with her?" "Yes, looking pale and decorative, which suits her." "Gerald Creswell arrived from London yesterday. Lavinia's nephew, with that unpleasant pince-nez and the air of apologizing to furniture. Lionel Arkwright from the chemist's was there too, bringing cough lozenges or sentiment, one never knows which. Vera Pritchard came on bazaar business. The place is full." Miss Marple nodded. One could do a good deal in a crowded house if one understood the value of being overlooked. There was more village talk after that, and much of it the usual sort. Who had ordered new hatpins from Basing? Whose maid had given notice? Whether the butcher had become unreliable since Christmas? Yet the little trail of foolish incidents persisted in the conversation, like a thread one could not quite draw free. When Miss Marple left Gossington Hall, the winter light was thinning. She chose the longer way home past the church and Ferny Court. The house stood behind low yews, its windows reflecting a sky of dim silver. A maid was crossing the hall with a tray. At the gate, Vera Pritchard emerged in her dark felt hat, her chin lifted, or her gloves pulled on too quickly. She almost collided with Gerald Creswell, who had just come down the drive. "My dear Miss Pritchard," he said with an uneasy little laugh, "one would think we were all burglars, coming and going like this." Vera said, "If there are burglars, perhaps they are interested in marmalade," and passed on. Gerald stood a moment looking after her. He was a narrow, fair man of 40 or thereabouts, correct in dress and somehow untidy in expression. He saw Miss Marple bowed and came to the gate. "My aunt is in an absurd state over these petty annoyances," he said. "I suppose the village will enjoy the drama." "Villages do enjoy patterns," said Miss Marple. He blinked. "Patterns?" "In behaviour," said Miss Marple. "One notices them." He smiled, but there was colour high in his cheeks. "Oh, shh! Hope you will notice nothing too dreadful in St. Mary Mead." Before she could answer, the front door opened and Mrs. Creswell's voice came clear across the cold air. "Gerald, if you have finished loitering, kindly come in, and tell Beatrice I will have the January jars moved. I do not choose to have them meddled with again." The door shut. Gerald gave an awkward little nod and went back up the drive. Miss Marple walked on, but slowly. January jars, she thought, a curious phrase. At Ferny Court, the stillroom shelves were ordered by month, for Mrs. Creswell liked her preserves dated, labelled, and morally arranged. It seemed an oddly specific instruction to utter in a doorway. At the corner by the lich gate, she paused. The kitchen window of Ferny Court showed a strip of yellow light. Against it, for an instant, she saw the black outline of a cat upon the sill. Tibbs, the marmalade-coloured creature that haunted the pantry and still room. The cat was motionless, staring inward as cats will do when something interests them. Then, as Miss Marple watched, a hand reached across the window from inside the room and drew the blind down sharply. What, she wondered, had there been in that kitchen which someone preferred the village not to see? The next morning St. Mary Mead awoke under a white mist, which clung low among the hedges and made the church tower appear to float, detached from the earth. Miss Marple, having attended to her correspondence and instructed her maid regarding a particularly tiresome patch in the rose border, set out for Ferny Court shortly after 11. Mrs. Creswell had sent, not for her exactly, but for Mrs. Bantry, and Dolly had insisted that Jane should accompany her. "Lavinia wants sympathy," Dolly had said. "You may give her sense, which is better." They were shown into the morning room, where Mrs. Lavinia Creswell sat bolt upright in a chair with carved lions upon the arms. She was a tall woman still, though age had sharpened and dried her. Her hair was iron grey and dressed with precision. Beside her stood Miss Cecily Harbottle, the companion, a fair young woman with smooth hair, a dark blue frock, and that peculiarly efficient quietness, which often means one is listening all the time. "My dear Dolly," said Mrs. Creswell, in a voice which conveyed that affection must never interfere with standards, "I'm obliged to you for coming, Miss Marple. Pray sit down. I am suffering from folly." "That is very prevalent," said Dolly. "It has become systematic," returned Mrs. Creswell. "I have no objection to youth being silly in the abstract. I do object to silliness entering my still room. Yesterday 3 jars were moved from the January shelf to March. 1 label had been loosened. This morning the key of the preserve cupboard was found in the umbrella stand." Miss Marple folded her gloves. "Was anything taken? No, that is what is so vulgar. Nothing is stolen, things are touched." Cecily Harbottle said quietly, "Mrs. Creswell feels the household discipline has been interfered with." "Household discipline," said Dolly, "is always the first casualty." Mrs. Creswell ignored her. "Beatrice swears the maids know nothing. Arthur Binns has been insolent when questioned. Gerald says I make too much of trifles, as Gerald is often wrong." At that moment, Gerald himself came in, carrying a sheet of notepaper. He seemed surprised to find the room full. "I beg your pardon, Aunt Lavinia, this was on the hall table. I imagine it is part of the same idiocy." He handed the paper over. Mrs. Creswell read it, and a hard flush rose under the fine skin of her cheeks. "Read it," said Dolly. Mrs. Creswell passed the paper. The words had been printed in clumsy capitals with a violet copying pencil. "Keep to your own jars." There was a short silence. "How extremely childish," said Cecily. Miss Marple looked at the message longer than the others. The paper was from a cheap exercise book, torn raggedly at the top. "Have you enemies connected with jars?" asked Dolly. "Everybody who enters a committee room in England is connected with jars," said Mrs. Creswell. "It is not amusing." Gerald gave a strained laugh. "Surely some kitchen maid has a sense of humour." Beatrice Pike, the housekeeper, came in almost at once with coffee, as if the mention of kitchen maids had summoned her. She was a large woman with reddish hands and a determined mouth. Her eyes went quickly to the note, then away. "If there is any more nonsense, madam," she said, "I shall turn the house upside down." "You may begin with Arthur," said Mrs. Creswell. "He has the look of lurking." Beatrice compressed her lips. "Arthur has the look the Lord gave him." When she had gone, Miss Marple asked in her mildest tone, "Did Mr. Binns have any reason to resent your household, Mrs. Creswell?" "Reasons are always available to the lower orders," said Mrs. Creswell. "He was refused fallen oranges from the south wall last week. He may think citrus a grievance." Dolly threw Miss Marple a sideways glance. There was, in that dry answer, a ridiculousness which ought to have lightened the atmosphere. It did not. The note upon the table lay there with a curious air of being at once petty and deliberate. Presently, Lionel Arkwright was announced. He was the chemist from the village, a well-looking man with a neat brown moustache, and hands too carefully washed to be quite trustworthy. He had brought a sleeping draught which Dr. Haydock had suggested for Mrs. Creswell's nerves, though Mrs. Creswell said immediately that her nerves required no assistance, and asked him instead whether the copies of the bazaar circular had been sent. "They were sent yesterday afternoon," said Lionel. "Miss Pritchard saw to them." "Miss Pritchard sees to too much," said Mrs. Creswell. Still, she has energy." Cecily moved to the escritoire for the circulars. Gerald, standing by the mantelpiece, put down his hand upon a porcelain jar as though steadying himself. Miss Marple noticed that his cuff carried a faint orange stain, not bright, but dull and sticky, as if something sweet had dried there and been imperfectly removed. He saw her looking and drew his hand back at once. "It is the kitchen," he said lightly. "One brushes against half the county's preserves in this house." "No doubt," said Miss Marple. Mrs. Creswell turned sharply to Cecily. "You have not told them. I shall do so. On Saturday, at the close of the bazaar, I intend to make an announcement regarding Ferny Court." Gerald looked up. "An announcement?" "Yes. Since the village has chosen to busy itself with my shelves, it may as well have something of substance to discuss. I have altered certain arrangements. Mr. Enderby will attend." "The solicitor?" said Dolly. "The solicitor," said Mrs. Creswell. "I dislike surprises myself, but other people seem to enjoy them." Gerald said nothing. His face had become very white beneath its careful composure. Miss Marple's knitting, lying folded in her reticule, seemed suddenly a solid, comforting thing in a room that had turned uncertain. A new arrangement, a solicitor, a house full of people who had reasons, visible or invisible, for preferring the future to alter in one direction rather than another. As she and Dolly took their leave, Tibbs the cat slipped along the passage from the back regions of the house. He paused by the stand where walking sticks and umbrellas were kept. It sniffed with great attention at the brass tray beneath, and then sat down beside it, his tail tucked neatly round his paws. Miss Marple looked at the umbrella stand. At the bottom lay a small paper circle, gum side upward, faintly sticky and smelling unmistakably of Seville orange. If the key had been there that morning, who had put the seal beside it, and why? Mrs. Creswell died the following morning, a little before 9 o'clock, in the breakfast-room at Ferny Court, with the January light thin upon the windows and a single triangle of toast upon her plate. The village heard of it in layers. First the bell at Dr. Haydock's house. Then the hurried bicycle of the under-gardener sent for the police. Then the housemaid from Ferny Court, pale with importance and terror, are telling the baker's wife in confidence, and thereby half the village within 20 minutes. Miss Marple was at Danemead when Dolly's motor came rattling up the lane. Dolly came in without ceremony. "Lavinia is dead." Miss Marple rose at once. "How?" They say heart failure. They also say breakfast. And Gerald has already gone about looking like a bereaved nephew in a melodrama, which makes me suspicious on principle. Inspector Slack is there. At Ferny Court, the air in the hall had the stale, arrested feel that houses acquire when death has entered them unexpectedly, and ordinary duties do not know where to put themselves. A constable stood by the front door. In the morning room, Beatrice Pike was weeping in a practical, angry fashion. Cecily Harbottle sat very straight, holding a handkerchief she had not used. Gerald walked up and down with quick, exasperated steps, his grief repeatedly checked by annoyance. Inspector Slack emerged from the breakfast room. He nodded shortly to Miss Marple, and more respectfully to Dolly. "No need for visitors, ladies." "We are friends of the house," said Dolly. "Then you may remain in here and keep out of the way. Doctor's not satisfied. Says it may be poison." Gerald stopped walking. "Poison? Really, Inspector? That is absurd." Dr. Haydock appeared behind Slack, his face grave. "It may not be absurd at all. Mrs. Creswell had a sound enough heart for her age. I should prefer not to guess." Slack grunted. Tray was brought in at 8:30 by the parlour-maid. Coffee, toast, marmalade. At 8:45, Miss Harbottle went in and found Mrs. Creswell collapsed beside the table. Window shut, door to hall open, yet no signs of struggle. Miss Marple said quietly, had she eaten much? Haydock glanced at her. "Very little. One bite of toast, some coffee, that is all." "And the marmalade?" asked Miss Marple. "There was marmalade on the toast." Slack frowned. "Why does everyone in this house speak as if marmalade were a matter for the Home Office?" "Because," said Beatrice Pike suddenly from the sofa, "it was wrong." Everyone turned. "What was wrong?" said Slack. "The jar, the toast, all of it." Mrs. Creswell took her breakfast exact. Coffee first, then half a slice dry, then, if she was in one of her notions, a scraping of marmalade. A scraping, mind? Not that mess. Cecily said in a low voice, "There was rather a lot on it." Slack's expression hardened. "You might have said so before." Beatrice wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Here I am saying it now." Haydock said Mrs. Creswell had been limiting sugar for months. Gerald gave an impatient movement. Surely these domestic refinements have nothing to do with her death. Miss Marple did not look at him. Sometimes they have everything to do with it. Slack, with obvious reluctance, led them to the breakfast room one by one. The table had not yet been disturbed. Upon the white cloth stood a coffee pot, cup and saucer, toast rack, butter dish, and a cut glass jar of marmalade with its silver spoon beside it. On the plate lay the half-eaten piece of toast. The marmalade had been spread thickly, and beneath it one saw the pale gloss of butter. Miss Marple stood still. That, then, was the detail. Butter beneath marmalade. Mrs. Creswell would not have done it. Beatrice had said so without saying it. Cecily, too, he had noticed. Whoever prepared that toast had done so according to habit or taste, not Lavinia's own. She looked at the jar. The paper seal had been slit with something sharp and folded. Its label, in Mrs. Creswell's neat hand, read Seville, January 14th breakfast. "Breakfast," said Miss Marple softly. "Yes," said Beatrice behind her. "Madam kept a few small jars apart for household use. The prize jars were in the still room." Slack bent over the cloth. "We have the note as well, found by the plate." He held up a second scrap of exercise book paper. "One must pay for meddling." Gerald uttered an exclamation. Cecily put a hand to her throat. Dolly looked from the note to the marmalade jar, and back again. "How nasty," she said. "How useful," said Slack. "If somebody thought to make murder look like village foolery, he may find the joke costs him." Lionel Arkwright was brought in next, because he had called at the house shortly after 8, with an invoice Mrs. Creswell had demanded. Vera Pritchard had telephoned, after some difficulty since the exchange girl cried, to say she had posted bazaar letters and gone nowhere near Ferny Court that morning. Arthur Binns had been in the South Garden. Everyone had a place. No one had yet a clean conscience. Miss Marple's gaze had gone to the sideboard. There, among silver covers and breakfastware, lay a penknife with orange gum along the blade. "Whose is that?" she asked. Beatrice stared. "Not mine," Gerald said, after a pause scarcely longer than a breath. "It is probably mine. I opened a parcel yesterday." "A marmalade jar is not a parcel," said Dolly. No one answered, and when they were back in the morning room, Slack was already dictating names to his sergeant. An inquest would follow. The breakfast things would be taken. The jar would go to analysis. Very likely the poison, if poison there was, would be discovered in due course. But Miss Marple sat with folded hands and thought, not of analysis, but of schoolrooms, nurseries, and people who enjoyed disturbing the position of things. There were persons she knew whose idea of power began with teasing and ended, if life suited them, in cruelty. Outside in the passage, Tibbs gave a sudden complaining cry. A servant tried to hush him. The cat had sprung to the windowsill and was staring toward the back of the house, where the still room lay. What, Miss Marple wondered, had the cat expected to find there that was no longer in its place? Inspector Slack disliked Miss Marple's presence in principle, but he had long since learned that principle and convenience seldom kept the same hours. By afternoon he permitted Dr. Haydock, Dolly Bantry, and Miss Marple to walk through the back premises of Ferny Court, provided that they touched nothing, and asked no servant anything likely to put ideas in their heads. The still room stood beyond the kitchen, cool even in winter, with shelves upon 3 walls and a high window looking toward the orchard. Mrs. Creswell had ruled there with the austerity of a chemist and the vanity of an artist. Jars shone in rows, labels marched in her clean, slanted script. January upon the left, February along the centre, March upon the far wall. Orange, amber, ruby, and green preserves glowed behind glass like a chapel of domestic order, yet the order had been strained. 2 spaces stood empty upon the January shelf. On a lower row, 1 jar had been replaced crookedly. Another bore a label whose corner had lifted. Miss Marple moved no nearer than the doorway. "How often was this room used?" she asked. Beatrice Pike, standing stiffly behind them, answered, "Daily, by Madame, or by me." But the dated shelves were hers. She liked to count. Was anything kept here besides preserves? Cakes in tins, bottles, the silver preserve spoons in that drawer. Slack opened it. Inside lay 6 spoons wrapped in flannel, each with a small ivory disc tied to the handle for use at competitions or committee teas. 1 space in the flannel was empty. "The spoon from breakfast," said Slack. "Quite," said Miss Marple. Cecily Harbottle had followed them, pale and composed. Mrs. Creswell was particular that the breakfast jars should come from the pantry cupboard, not from here. She said the still room was for stock and inspection. Miss Marple turned to her. Then the jar on the breakfast table ought not to have come from this room. No, unless Beatrice sent it by mistake. Beatrice gave a snort of pure contempt. "I do not send cut-glass prize jars to breakfast." Lionel Arkwright, who had been speaking with Slack in the kitchen, came to the doorway. His face looked drawn. "The chemist's analysis will take time," he said. "If you wish for a practical guess, marmalade would hide many bitter tastes." "Thank you," said Miss Marple, "but practical guesses are often too practical." He flushed. "I did not mean—" "No," said Miss Marple kindly. "Of course not." She let her eyes wander over the shelves. Something about the dates interested her. Mrs. Creswell had labelled the jars by the day they were made, not merely the month, January 3rd, January 7th, January 14th, January 21st. It was the habit of someone who liked to compare, to judge, perhaps to remember more than taste required. One jar, empty, stood at the back, turned so that its label could not be seen. "May one ask," she said, "why Mrs. Creswell separated the January batches so carefully?" Cecily answered, "She had a notion that flavour altered according to weather and peel. She wrote everything down." "That sounds like Lavinia," said Dolly. Slack, who had been prowling with the disappointed air of a man finding too many clean shelves and too few pistol cases, held up a small key. "Found under this dresser," he said. "Preserve cupboard key, according to Beatrice. It had been missing last week. Things are forever under dressers," said Beatrice grimly, "or put there." Miss Marple glanced at the floor. Beneath the dresser lay a scattering of dry orange peel, and among it a crumb of blue sealing wax. "Not red, blue. How very curious," she murmured. Slack followed her gaze. "What of it? Nothing, perhaps. Only it is not kitchen wax." Gerald Creswell appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed and visibly strained. "Inspector, Mr. Enderby has arrived. He wishes to know whether my aunt's papers may be secured." "Secured?" said Slack sharply. "They stay where they are till I say otherwise." Gerald's mouth tightened. "Naturally." Miss Marple looked at him. "Did your aunt keep her papers in the study?" He hesitated a fraction too long. "Where else should she keep them?" Dolly, who had been watching him with frank dislike, said, "That is not an answer." Gerald gave a dry little laugh. "My dear Mrs. Bantry, I am not on trial." "Not yet," said Dolly. After he had gone, Miss Marple remained in the still-room doorway. Tibbs had slipped in round Beatrice's skirts, and now sat before the January shelf, tail flicking, staring at the empty spaces as if a philosophical problem had been presented to him. "Cats," said Beatrice, "are forever after warmth and smells." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "and routine. They know when a thing has been shifted." Beatrice looked tired suddenly, older than she had seemed. "Madam counted the January jars last night herself," she said. "Said if someone wanted mischief, they should not have it cheap. She was upset, though she would never own it. It sat in the parlour with those bizarre papers and that solicitor's letter, and then sent me for the big account book. After that, she went to the still room alone." Miss Marple's eyes lifted. "At what hour?" "Nigh on 10. "And afterward?" "I cannot say. I went to bed." Mrs. Creswell had gone to the still room alone after receiving a solicitor's letter. That suggested not flavour, but concealment. Miss Marple looked once more at the empty space on the January shelf and at the crooked jar beside it. If something had been hidden there, who knew of it? If nothing had been hidden there, why did the shelves show the marks of fingers more concerned with searching than stealing? From the front of the house came the sound of Mr. Enderby's grave voice and Gerald's lower, urgent one. Miss Marple drew her shawl more closely about her shoulders. If Ferny Court had become a place where people searched among marmalade jars for something other than marmalade, what precisely was missing? The inquest, brief and unsatisfactory as such proceedings so often are, established only what St. Mary Mead had already begun to suspect. Mrs. Lavinia Creswell had died from arsenic. A quantity sufficient to kill had been found in the marmalade, upon the toast, and in the jar from which it had been taken. The poison could not, the doctor said, have been accidental. That simple statement altered the climate of the village. What had been nasty became grave. What had been silly became deliberate. Even Mrs. Price Ridley lowered her voice. Inspector Slack set about his inquiries with relish. By the end of 2 days, he had collected motives enough to start a small county, and contradictions enough to furnish it. Cecily Harbottle admitted under pressure that she had concealed an understanding with Lionel Arkwright. Mrs. Creswell had disapproved and told her plainly that marriage, if it took place, must take place without a penny from Ferny Court. Cecily, pale but steady, said that such a threat did not make one a poisoner. Lionel Arkwright admitted, more reluctantly, that small quantities of arsenic compounds were kept in the chemist's stores, though none, he declared, were missing. Dr. Haydock observed dryly that a country household could procure poison from 6 common sources without troubling a chemist at all. Vera Pritchard, when questioned about bazaar accounts, he proved to have used church money temporarily to settle a dressmaker's bill, meaning to replace it after a legacy she expected from Mrs. Creswell. She wept, then grew angry, and demanded whether everyone in St. Mary Mead would be exposed for every stupid thing they had ever done. Beatrice Pike was discovered to have let her nephew Arthur Binns into the house after hours on more than one occasion, so that he might take scraps, and once an old coat from the servants' hall. Arthur himself had, it appeared, also been helping himself to oranges from the south wall. His explanation that oranges hanging in winter looked as if they wanted company did not improve his position. Gerald Creswell's affairs proved less comfortable still. Mr. Enderby, the solicitor, disclosed that Gerald had debts, not ruinous perhaps, but disgraceful to a man in his position. Mrs. Creswell had assisted him twice, and written that there should be no third occasion. "Then there is the will," said Dolly Bantry, reporting matters that evening at Danemead, "or the want of one." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "No will. An older will exists, leaving Ferny Court and the bulk of the money to Gerald, with legacies to the servants and to Cecily. But Enderby is certain Lavinia had instructed him to prepare a new codicil. He sent it for signature 3 days before her death. It has not been found." Miss Marple's needles paused. "Not in the desk, not in the desk, not in the study, not anywhere. Gerald says she probably forgot to sign it. Enderby says she was not a woman who forgot signed papers." Miss Marple resumed knitting. "No," she said, "she would not forget. She would place." Dolly stared. "Place what?" "Important things. Certain women do. They prefer an object to a drawer. Drawers invite rummaging." The next afternoon, Inspector Slack, in a mood partly triumphant and partly thwarted, interviewed the principal persons once more in the library at Ferny Court. And Miss Marple, by some combination of age, insignificance, and Dolly Bantry's determination, found herself quietly present. Gerald sat near the window, fingers drumming on the arm of his chair until he noticed it and stopped. His fair hair was brushed too flat. There were hollows under his eyes. "I loved my aunt in my fashion," he said. "If she chose to tyrannize over money, that was her way. It did not mean I wished her dead." "In what fashion did you love her?" asked Slack. Gerald stared. "Really? Inspector, one asks because practical arrangements seem to have occupied you both. Cecily Harbottle, opposite him, lowered her gaze. Her hands were beautifully still. Beatrice Pike answered questions with an obstinate honesty which told against her and for her at once. Yes, she had quarrelled with Mrs. Creswell over Arthur. Yes, she had entered the still room on the fatal morning before breakfast was carried in. No, she had not touched the breakfast tray. Yes, she had seen Mr. Gerald in the passage near the pantry about 8:20. No, she had not mentioned it because gentlemen walked about houses. Gerald said sharply, "I was looking for cigarettes." "In the pantry?" said Slack. "I had been told they were there." "By whom?" Gerald hesitated. "I do not remember." Vera Pritchard, thin and flushed, as admitted having been at Ferny Court the previous evening to deliver corrected circulars. She had waited in the hall while Cecily fetched Mrs. Creswell. During that wait, she had seen Gerald come from the back passage, carrying what looked like a jar wrapped in brown paper. "A jar?" said Gerald with open irritation. "This is nonsense." "It may be nonsense," said Slack, "but it is the sort I collect." Lionel Arkwright confessed that Cecily had spoken of being miserable and trapped. He denied absolutely that he had ever supplied her with poison. When asked whether arsenic might be disguised in marmalade, he replied that everyone now asked him the same question, as though chemists spent the day poisoning breakfasts. Miss Marple watched them all. Vera restless and ashamed. Lionel defensive. Cecily controlled to the edge of brittleness, and Beatrice angry. Gerald fatigued, affronted, and beneath it all, very like a boy caught upsetting drawers, and determined to insist he had only been looking. When the others had gone, Slack lingered. "Well, Miss Marple, since you are here," Miss Marple gave a little smile, "I was thinking only that people who do mischievous things often begin by wanting to see how much disturbance they can produce without consequences. It is a habit that may grow." Slack snorted. "That is philosophy, not evidence." "Human nature is often better than evidence," said Miss Marple. As she rose to leave, Tibbs slipped into the library. The cat went straight, not to the hearth, but to Gerald's chair, and sniffed at the hem of his overcoat which lay over the back. Then Tibbs sneezed, shook his head sharply, and trotted away. There was, unmistakably, a scent of oranges upon the cloth. Why, Miss Marple wondered, should a man who claimed indifference to preserves carry the smell of marmalade about him like a signature? The second disturbance came on a Thursday night, after the village had just begun to settle into the grim comfort of believing that the worst had already happened. At a little after 10, Beatrice Pike, sleeping lightly as women of responsibility often do, heard a crash from Certainly, continuing from Chapter 6, and I shall bring the story to its close in Chapter 11. At a little after 10, Beatrice Pike, sleeping lightly as women of responsibility often do, heard a crash from the back of the house. It was not a great crash, not the violent splintering one associates with burglars in melodrama, but a thick, intimate sound, as if glass had fallen among wooden things and been at once muffled. She was out of bed at once, thrusting her feet into slippers and catching up a candle, though the passage gas had been left turned low. By the time she reached the stone corridor beyond the kitchen, Arthur Binns had come in from the yard door, his coat collar up and his hair full of frost. "What is it?" he whispered. Beatrice gave him one annihilating glance. "What are you doing here at this hour?" Before he could answer, she pushed open the still-room door. The cold came out first, then the smell of oranges, then the sight itself. 3 jars from the January shelf had been smashed upon the flags. Shreds of paper label clung wetly to the stone. A wooden chair, usually kept by the wall, had been dragged beneath the high window, when the window itself stood open by 6 inches, letting in a blade of white moonlight and a draught that stirred the hanging herbs. The preserve drawer had been pulled half out, and one of the wrapped silver spoons lay on the floor. Tibbs the cat sat beside the broken glass, tail beating irritably against the leg of the dresser. He was staring, not at the window, but at the lowest shelf, where 1 jar alone had been turned back to front. Beatrice set down the candle. "Do not move," she said to Arthur. "Do not so much as breathe." Arthur, who had the unfortunate look of a young man perpetually discovered somewhere he ought not to be, lifted both hands. "I came because I saw a light from the lane. You thought perhaps there might be something worth stealing," said Beatrice. "You and save yourself the trouble of honesty." There was a sound behind them. Inspector Slack, who had stationed a constable at the front and another by the yard since the inquest, came in briskly, buttoning his coat. "What have we now?" Beatrice pointed. Slack stooped over the broken jars. His fingers, broad and official, hovered without touching. "Still searching," he said. "For what?" asked Miss Marple softly from the doorway. No one had heard her come in. She stood wrapped in a dark cloak, Dolly Bantry just behind her, both women having been summoned from their beds by the extraordinary speed with which news travelled where servants and policemen were concerned. Slack straightened. "You ought not to be here." "Very likely," said Miss Marple, "but one so often is." Her eyes went over the room and rested upon the chair under the window. "A very inconvenient method of entry," she observed. "If entry it was, the chair is on the wrong side." Slack looked. It was true. Anyone climbing in from outside would have needed the chair beneath the sill before entering, not after. As it stood, it served only a person who wished to reach the upper shelves from within the room. Arthur shifted his feet. "I never touched it," he muttered. Miss Marple glanced at him. "No, I do not think you did." On the stones near the broken glass lay a small curl of blue wax, softened by marmalade and dusted with sugar. Miss Marple had seen such wax before, beneath the dresser. It seemed to interest Tibbs a good deal. The cat sniffed it, recoiled, and then turned his attention to the back-turned jar on the lower shelf, giving a short, urgent cry. Slack took the jar down. The label, when turned round, read in Mrs. Creswell's fine hand, "January 21st, Seville, thick cut." The waxed paper seal had been broken and roughly put back. "Another one meddled with," said Dolly. "No," said Miss Marple, "not another, the same business." Beatrice, breathing quickly, said, "There were 4 jars on that shelf this afternoon, 4. Now there are 3, and these broken bits make only 2. Slack stared at the shelf, counting. "You are certain?" "As certain as I am of my own apron strings." "1 jar missing, then," said Slack. "Taken through the window, perhaps." Miss Marple said nothing at once. She was looking at the sticky tracks on the stone. The broken marmalade had spread in amber fans. Through it ran the sharp print of a man's shoe, not away from the window, but towards the door. The intruder had not escaped that way. He had wished them to think so. Arthur Binns was taken into the kitchen and questioned until midnight. He had indeed been near the house, but for the silliest and most harmless of reasons. He had arranged to meet one of the under-housemaids by the ash bins, and had seen a movement in the still-room window. Being both foolish and curious, he had come closer. That was all. The under-housemaid, rosy with misery and shame, confirmed as much. "It is exactly the sort of thing that makes young men look guilty when they are only tiresome," said Dolly later. Miss Marple, warming her hands at the kitchen range, nodded. "Yes, real guilt very often prefers someone else's tiresomeness. What do you make of it, Jane?" Miss Marple looked towards the still-room door. "Marmalade, Mischief, murder," she said. "They do belong together, but the mischief came first. And that is the important thing. It was not a decoration added afterward. It was a habit." Beatrice, who had been listening, said in a low voice, "Madam used to say of Mr. Gerald, when he was a boy, that if a thing were straight, he must tilt it, and if a thing were private, he must peep." Miss Marple turned. Did she say that often? Often enough. And in the still room, where the shelves still gleamed in their strange order, and the night air crept through the open window, one question settled over everything like frost. What had been hidden among the January jars that someone was still prepared to risk discovery in order to find? The next morning, Miss Marple paid 2 calls. The first was upon Mr. Enderby, the solicitor, who lived in a yellow brick house near Market Basing, and looked exactly as a solicitor ought. Grave, tidy, and faintly apologetic for the frailty of human arrangements. The second was upon an elderly lady named Miss Elspeth Pelling, once governess to Gerald Creswell in his youth, now residing with a married sister on a modest income and a vast reserve of memory. It was Miss Pelling who proved the more illuminating. She received Miss Marple in a room over-furnished with antimacassars and framed texts, and listened to the object of the visit with a kind of lean satisfaction. "Gerald," she said, "yes, charming little boy, always smiling. One would have said butter would not melt in his mouth, though I never trusted boys who looked as if they had been made out of starch and politeness." Miss Marple, who knew the type, inclined her head. "Was he mischievous?" Miss Pelling gave a dry laugh. "Mischievous is too pleasant a word. He had a gift for interference. He would move one's spectacles from the writing-table to the mantelpiece, and then stand by while one searched. He changed the labels on my medicine bottles once. Not enough to do harm, by good fortune, but enough to make me take quinine for indigestion and soda for my nerves. He thought it exquisitely amusing. When reproved, he was wounded. Always wounded. How old was he then? 12. At 15 he opened his aunt's letters with steam and resealed them. At 17 he borrowed money from the stable boy, and convinced the poor lad he had offered it of his own free will. He never broke things by violence if he could disturb them quietly. That was his pleasure." Miss Marple sat very still. "It reminds me," she said, "of a little boy in St. Mary Mead, who used to unsettle beehives with a walking stick from behind the hedge. He was always astonished when people said the bees objected." Miss Pelling looked approving. "Exactly so." Did Mrs. Creswell know this side of her nephew? "My dear Miss Marple, she spent half her life correcting it, quite without success." There was, moreover, a letter. Miss Pelling had kept many old papers. Governesses, like solicitors, are often the custodians of other people's regrettable habits. Among them was a note from Lavinia Creswell, written years earlier. "Gerald has again been amusing himself with rearrangements. He does not steal, which would be simpler to punish. He meddles. One cannot lock up every drawer in a house against one young man's appetite for disturbance." Miss Marple asked whether she might borrow the letter for a day. Miss Pelling, who clearly hoped at last to be useful against Gerald's memory, agreed at once. At Mr. Enderby's office, the matter of the codicil advanced a little further. "Yes," he said, removing his pince-nez and polishing it with care. "Mrs. Creswell signed the codicil on Friday afternoon. I have no doubt whatever on that point." "You saw her sign it?" "I did. She signed both the codicil and a covering note to myself, stating that she would keep the document in her own possession until the Saturday Bazaar announcement." "Did she say where?" "Not directly. She made some remark about preferring glass to mahogany. I assumed it one of those domestic metaphors by which strong-minded ladies conceal perfectly practical intentions." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Did the codicil materially alter Mr. Gerald Creswell's expectations?" Mr. Enderby's face rearranged itself into professional reluctance. "I suppose I may say, in present circumstances, that it did. Under the older will he inherited nearly everything, subject to legacies. Under the new codicil, Ferny Court was to pass after certain life interests into a small charitable trust for district nursing and convalescent care. Miss Harbottle received an income. The servants' legacies were enlarged. Mr. Gerald Creswell was reduced to an annuity sufficient to keep him from destitution and, Mrs. Creswell hoped, from folly." "A severe correction," said Miss Marple, "a rational one." "And if the codicil were not found?" "The earlier will would stand." That was the shape of it then. Simple enough in motive, yet simple motives sometimes walk in very elaborate shoes. When Miss Marple returned to St. Mary Mead, she found Dolly waiting with fresh indignation. Slack says Arthur may still have been in it, because country boys know about rat poison. And Vera Pritchard has told half the village that Cecily wept in the shrubbery. One would think tears a felony. Miss Marple laid Miss Pelling's letter on the small table beside her knitting basket. "My dear Dolly, the interesting point is not who could have got poison. It is who made mischief in order to search, and searched in order to keep from losing money." Dolly read the old note and whistled softly. So Lavinia always knew. Yes, but people are very odd about their own relations. They imagine defects are temporary if they are familial. "And Gerald, said Miss Marple, "is a man who likes to move things and watch the confusion, as such persons often think murder is merely a larger rearrangement." Dolly looked shocked, then grim. "That is hideous." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but not uncommon." Toward evening there came a further small revelation. Beatrice Pike, turning out a side cabinet in the morning room, found the household recipe ledger. Mrs. Creswell had kept it for years. Between instructions for crabapple jelly and quince cheese, there were notes in the margin in her own hand. One entry, made 3 days before her death, ran January 14th. Batch useful, after all, better than the escritoire. Blue seal quite hidden. Beatrice brought the book straight to Miss Marple. There it was at last, the hidden history and the hidden object meeting upon a single page. The codicil had been sealed in blue wax and hidden with, or in, the January 14th marmalade jar. Oh, but if that jar had stood upon the breakfast table on the morning of Lavinia's death, why had the murderer brought out precisely that jar? Unless he had already looked into it and found what he wanted, or meant to look once the poison had done its work. Inspector Slack was not pleased by the recipe ledger. He was the sort of man who preferred clues to appear one at a time, and with proper deference to police arrangements. "Very well," he said. "The codicil may have been hidden in a marmalade jar. That still leaves half the county able to look for it." Miss Marple agreed that this was true, yet she did not think half the county had done so. The house at Ferny Court had grown strained in a quiet, inward fashion. Doors were shut more carefully than before. Servants spoke in undertones. As Cecily Harbottle moved from room to room with a composed face and the exhausted eyes of someone living in a house where every object might be evidence. Vera Pritchard came and went on parish excuses, giving the impression of eagerness covered with black gloves. Lionel Arkwright seemed perpetually summoned, whether for medicines, signatures, or mere reassurance. Gerald remained because to leave would look wrong and to stay required nerve. Miss Marple watched. It seemed to her that Vera was frightened, Lionel annoyed, Cecily grieved, and Gerald inconvenienced. That distinction mattered. There was another contradiction. The childish notes had all been printed in violet copying pencil. Vera used such pencils for bazaar lists. Slack seized upon that with rustic satisfaction and began to press her more sharply. Vera, driven hard, who confessed another unpleasant truth. On the evening before the murder, Gerald had asked to borrow pencils and paper from the committee room at the schoolhouse where bazaar tickets were being arranged. He had said he wished to jot down a telephone number. She had thought nothing of it. "That looks bad for him," said Dolly. "It does," said Miss Marple, "which is why I hesitate to be pleased by it. Gerald is not clever in detail, but he is vain. A vain person is rarely content with such obvious borrowing unless he assumes everyone will think him too obvious to be guilty." Dolly stared. "Jane, how do you keep all these people in your head?" "My dear," said Miss Marple, "they are all in St. Mary Mead already. Only the names are altered." That afternoon she took tea with the vicar's wife, Griselda, who knew more than perhaps she ought of village comings and goings. It emerged that on the Saturday before the murder, Gerald had spent half an hour alone in the schoolroom after the bazaar committee dispersed. On the Monday, he had been observed in animated dispute with his aunt near the lich gate. On the Tuesday, Tibbs the cat had been discovered shut inside the pantry, where he never willingly remained. "Why is that important?" asked Griselda, wide-eyed. "Because cats are creatures of habit," said Miss Marple. "They interfere with secret operations merely by being present. People who meddle dislike witnesses, even feline ones." The same evening, Arthur Binns, unexpectedly useful, brought a recollection of his own. On the morning of the murder, before the household was fully astir, but he had seen Gerald come from the potting shed behind the south wall. "What was he doing there?" asked Slack. Arthur scratched his ear. "I thought maybe he was being sick, sir. He looked uncommon put out." The potting shed yielded only ordinary gardening materials: tools, string, packets of seed, and a tin of weed killer used for paths. Its ingredients included arsenic. Slack became energetic. Gerald became politely indignant. He had gone to the shed, he said, looking for cigarettes again, having been told by someone that the gardener smoked there. "Mr. Creswell," said Miss Marple later to Dolly, "is remarkable chiefly for always searching in absurd places for objects one would never keep there." "Unless he is searching for something else," said Dolly. "Just so." The smell of bitter orange still clung faintly to Gerald's overcoat when the hall fire warmed it. The penknife with marmalade gum had been his. The old governess's letter showed a lifetime's fondness for interfering with labels and arrangements. The recipe book placed the blue-sealed codicil in the January 14th jar. Yet Miss Marple was not satisfied. There remained the breakfast itself. A murderer may conceal motive badly, or search noisily, or borrow the wrong pencil. But the hand reveals itself in small domestic acts more surely than in crime. Someone had buttered Lavinia's toast before spreading the marmalade. Someone had laid on far too much preserve. Someone had chosen the wrong jar and the wrong spoon, and had assumed that breakfast was a generic matter rather than a personal ritual. That was not merely murderous. It was ignorant, and ignorance within intimacy has its own significance. When Miss Marple was leaving Ferny Court that evening, Cecily Harbottle detained her in the hall. "Miss Marple," she said quietly, "I do not know whether one ought to say such things, but Mr. Gerald asked me the day before Mrs. Creswell died whether his aunt ever kept papers in odd places. I thought he was joking. He often smiled as though he were joking." Miss Marple looked at her kindly. "And was he?" "No," said Cecily. "That is what frightened one afterward." Miss Marple laid a gloved hand for a moment upon the younger woman's sleeve. "Yes," she said, "people who meddle often smile. They think it softens the hand." But one thing remained obscure. If Gerald had found the codicil before the murder, where was it now? And if he had not found it, why had he used the January 14th jar, the very jar most likely to expose his search? It was Tibbs in the end who solved the material difficulty. Cats are not detectives, though foolish people sometimes say so, but they are tenacious about places, smells, and private conveniences. On the Friday morning, 2 days after the stillroom disturbance, Tibbs disappeared from the kitchen after breakfast and could not be found. Beatrice, alarmed because the cat had lately taken to yowling beneath certain cupboards, went out to call him near the ash yard. Miss Marple, who had come to Ferny Court on the pretext of returning a casserole dish, accompanied her. The ash bins stood behind a low wall near the old brick copper house. Frost had silvered their lids. From within the copper house came a faint scratching noise. "Tibbs," said Beatrice, "if you are in the wash-house again, I shall box your ears." She opened the door. Inside, in a corner among bundled newspapers and broken flower pots, Tibbs crouched over something with both paws. He looked up indignantly, gave one possessive growl of a most uncat-like character, and sat back. The something was sticky with soot and wrapped in brown paper charred at the edges. Beatrice bent, then recoiled. "It is glass." Inspector Slack was fetched. The parcel, unwrapped upon an old tray, proved to contain the remains of a marmalade jar, broken into 3 large pieces and several smaller ones. The label was scorched but legible enough. January 14th, Seville, breakfast. Inside the jar, protected by waxed paper and a second wrapping of oilskin tied with blue thread, lay a roll of folded document paper sealed with blue wax. For the first time in the case, Slack forgot to object to Miss Marple's presence. Mr. Enderby was sent for at once. He opened the little parcel with fingers that trembled more than his voice did. "Yes," he said after a moment, "this is the codicil." It was singed around one margin, but still readable and duly signed. Mrs. Creswell's sharp signature ran across the bottom like a piece of resolve. Gerald Creswell, when informed, was admirable. That is to say, he looked precisely as an innocent man might look if long suspense had suddenly proved pointless. He put a hand to his forehead and said, "Thank God that at least her intentions are known." It was very well done. Only Miss Marple noticed that he did not ask where the codicil had been found. The contents were as Mr. Enderby had said. Ferny Court would not be Gerald's. A life annuity only. Substantial provision for Cecily Harbottle. enlarge legacies to Beatrice and other old servants, the residue into trust. Dolly Bantry read it and said with brutal honesty, "Well, there is your motive in plain black ink." Slack nodded, and the codicil hidden in the jar proved someone searched the preserves. Then, after the murder, someone found the right jar, took out the paper, tried to burn both, and bungled it. "Or was interrupted," said Miss Marple. "Yes, by whom?" Miss Marple looked down at Tibbs, who was washing one paw with satisfaction. The cat had dragged the charred parcel from behind a stack of old newspaper bundles, where it had been imperfectly concealed. Not burned in the copper, then. Only meant to be. By caution, she said. The person lacked time or nerve, or both. That afternoon she asked to see the breakfast tray list used by the parlour maid. It was a simple household card kept in the pantry. Coffee, toast, butter, one small breakfast jar from the cupboard, Morning Post if any. The cupboard held ordinary jars for daily use. The cut-glass January 14th jar had never belonged there. "Who set out the tray?" Miss Marple asked. The parlour-maid Ellen said nervously that she had arranged everything as usual and gone back for the coffee pot, which had not yet been filled. When she returned, the tray looked much the same, only the marmalade jar had been changed for the prettier one. "Did you think it odd?" "I thought perhaps Mr. Gerald had been helpful, miss. He was in the passage and said his aunt liked the better jars when annoyed." There it was. So small, so fatal, helpful. Miss Marple sat for some time in the morning-room afterward, her hands folded upon her knitting, and her eyes on the fire. Gerald had searched for the codicil, and found it in the January 14th jar, wrapped in blue wax. He had removed the paper, or perhaps merely opened the jar, and discovered it. On the fatal morning, he had used that same jar for the poisoned breakfast, meaning later to destroy it and its significance. After the death, he had taken away the codicil and hidden it in the copper house, intending to burn it. But he had delayed. He had always delayed. Meddlers do. They enjoy the possession of a thing before they dispose of it. Yet there remained one delicacy. A village may know, a police inspector may suspect, a solicitor may prove motive. But Miss Marple liked, whenever possible, or to understand not only what was done, but the exact little twist of mind by which it became possible. That evening, as the lamps came on in Ferny Court and the winter dark pressed at the windows, she sent word that everyone should assemble in the drawing-room after dinner. For she thought she knew now not only who had murdered Lavinia Creswell, but why the mischief had begun long before the murder itself, and whether Gerald Creswell, when pressed, would hold to injured innocence or collapse into affronted self-pity remained the last practical question. The drawing-room at Ferny Court was a large, comfortable room in which nobody was comfortable that evening. The curtains were drawn, the fire burned well, lamps stood where Lavinia Creswell had liked them, making islands of warm light among polished tables and framed miniatures. Yet the room had lost the secure temper of an established household. Every chair seemed provisional. Those present were few enough, though in village terms they represented half the moral furniture of the county. Inspector Slack stood by the mantelpiece with his notebook, suspicious of theatrics and resigned to them. Mr. Enderby sat upright upon a straight chair, legal and melancholy. Dolly Bantry occupied a sofa, as if prepared to take sides against anyone who required it. Cecily Harbottle sat very still beside the lamp. Lionel Arkwright, polished but uneasy, remained near the bookcase. Vera Pritchard looked pale and resentful. Beatrice Pike stood at the back, refusing a seat. Arthur Binns had been omitted by general consent. Gerald Creswell came last. He looked tired and exceedingly correct. Miss Marple sat near the fire with her knitting, which she seldom used at dramatic moments, but always carried, as other people carry reason. "I am afraid," she said, "that what I have to say may seem to begin in a trivial place. But murders very often do. People imagine them grander than they are. In reality, they are generally only the last stage of some small, habitual wrongness." Gerald gave a faint smile. "That sounds very philosophical, Miss Marple." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but it is also practical." She looked around the room. The first important thing was the mischief. The exchanged labels, the hidden keys, the childish notes, the orange peel tied upon gates. Those things were not as they seemed, an unrelated set of foolish pranks. They were the work of one mind, and they had two purposes. First, to create an atmosphere in which further disturbances at Ferny Court would be dismissed as silliness. Second, to permit searching. A person who has already been moving objects and altering labels may continue doing so without attracting notice. Slack grunted approval. Vera Pritchard said sharply, "You are not suggesting I—" "No," said Miss Marple. "You were careless and anxious and used violet pencils, that is all. Mr. Gerald borrowed those pencils because it suited him that childish notes should appear to come from bizarre circles and women's fussing." Gerald's smile thinned. "This is absurd." Miss Marple did not attend to him. The second important thing was Mrs. Creswell's habit of hiding what mattered in domestic places. She trusted her own arrangements more than locks. When the new codicil was signed, she hid it in the January 14th marmalade jar, wrapped in waxed paper and sealed with blue wax. We know that from the recipe ledger and from the codicil itself, which has now been found. Cecily drew breath softly. Beatrice closed her eyes for a moment. The person who searched the stillroom wanted that codicil. He knew enough to suspect it was hidden among the preserves. He did not know exactly where. So the village was treated to mischief, while Ferny Court was quietly ransacked in stages. Gerald said with sudden force, "Many people might have wanted the codicil." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "but only one of them had a lifelong taste for interference of precisely this kind." She lifted Miss Pelling's old letter. An old governess remembered Mr. Gerald as a boy who changed labels, moved spectacles, opened letters with steam, and enjoyed the confusion of others. Mrs. Creswell herself wrote of his amusing himself with rearrangements. That is a very exact description of what happened here. Gerald's face altered. The polish did not leave it, but the skin about the mouth tightened. "Childhood nonsense," he said. "Quite," said Miss Marple, "and not outgrown." There was silence in the room then, except for the soft settling of coal in the grate. Miss Marple laid down the letter and took up a different thread. On the morning of the murder, Ellen the parlour-maid set out the breakfast tray in the pantry. She left it briefly for the coffee pot. When she returned, the ordinary breakfast marmalade had been replaced by the cut-glass January 14th jar. Mr. Gerald was in the passage and told her, helpfully, that his aunt preferred the prettier jar. Gerald laughed, but there was no amusement in it. One may carry a tray or move a jar without becoming a poisoner. "Certainly," said Miss Marple, "but one does not, by chance, choose the very jar in which the missing codicil had been hidden. One does not, by chance, use a penknife with marmalade upon the blade. One does not by chance smell of bitter orange after searching still rooms, pantries, and ash bins. And above all, one does not by chance butter Mrs. Creswell's toast. Dolly gave a little start. Gerald looked at her blankly. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle. Mrs. Creswell never ate butter beneath marmalade. Beatrice knew it. Miss Harbottle knew it. A person intimate with her breakfast habits would know it also. But Mr. Gerald did not know. He prepared the toast according to his own taste, or ordinary assumption, to spread the poisoned marmalade too thickly, and sent in a breakfast no woman of Lavinia Creswell's habits would ever have prepared for herself. Slack had become very still. Gerald said in a low voice, "This is fantasy." Miss Marple looked at him with compassion, which was the hardest thing of all. "No, it is only human nature. You had found, or partly found, the codicil in the January jar, and knew enough to understand that your aunt meant to cut you off. Perhaps you hoped she had not signed it. Perhaps you meant to keep searching after breakfast. But you also knew she intended some public announcement on Saturday. So you used poison from the potting shed, put it in the marmalade, and altered the tray while Ellen was absent. After Mrs. Creswell died, you removed the codicil from the jar, hid it in the copper house, and attempted later to burn both jar and document. Then the still room was disturbed again, because you wished to make the search appear ongoing and general, not fixed upon one jar. She paused. There is only one thing I do not know. Whether you meant at first merely to frighten your aunt and snatch the codicil, or whether you intended murder from the moment you opened the poison tin. Gerald's composure broke, not violently, but with a sort of exhausted contempt. "Oh, she would have ruined everything," he said. "She never understood proportion. An annuity, as though I were some decayed aunt of hers. Ferny Court turned into a nursing charity. Money to Cecily, money to servants, to people, and all because she liked to control from beyond the grave." Cecily rose, white as paper. "I would rather have starved," she said. Gerald looked at her with irritation, as if she too had become inconveniently sincere. "It was never meant," he said, "to go so far. She was always meddling herself, always hiding things. One could not reason with her. And then she had to speak of Saturday, of announcements, of humiliations." He stopped. Miss Marple thought, with sadness rather than triumph, that the thing was finished. Inspector Slack moved from the mantelpiece. "Mr. Gerald Creswell, I must ask you to come with me." Gerald gave a small, helpless laugh. "All this over marmalade?" "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "Over mischief. Marmalade only kept the record." And as Slack took him away, the winter fire burned steadily on, warming the room that Lavinia Creswell had ruled, while all who remained felt the curious emptiness that follows explanation. Yet explanation, though necessary, was never the whole of justice. For one had still to live afterward with what one had understood. There was snow in St. Mary Mead 3 days later, a light, civilized snow that settled upon hedges and gateposts and seemed less like weather than correction. Gerald Creswell had confessed enough to spare the village the uglier forms of uncertainty, though not enough, perhaps, to satisfy Inspector Slack's appetite for complete stupidity in criminals. He admitted altering the breakfast tray and using poison from the potting shed. He admitted the childish notes, the borrowed violet pencil, the disturbances in the still room, and the attempted burning of the codicil in the copper house. He did not call these things wicked, he called them desperate. Men of his sort often do. The inquest concluded what everyone now knew. Mrs. Lavinia Creswell had been murdered by her nephew for gain, panic, and injured vanity, which taken together make a very serviceable motive. Ferny Court, once the legal arrangements settled, would pass according to the codicil. Mr. Enderby, with visible relief, began the machinery of the trust. Cecily Harbottle, to whom the future had looked for several days like a locked door, found it unexpectedly open. Beatrice Pike became practical again, which was her form of mourning. Vera Pritchard ceased crying and began accounting properly, which was almost as remarkable. Lionel Arkwright, one suspected, would ask Cecily to marry him once death was no longer the most recent topic in the house. Dolly Bantry came to tea at Dunmead and declared the whole thing infuriating. To think, she said, accepting a second scone, yet that it was all there from the beginning. Marmalade, mischief, murder. I ought to have seen it. My dear, said Miss Marple, pouring tea, it is very easy to see things when they are over. Much less easy when one is still feeling them. But the butter under the marmalade, how did you know that mattered so much? Miss Marple smiled. In villages, one knows what people eat and how they eat it, whether one wishes to or not. Lavinia Creswell disapproved of butter with marmalade, as she disapproved of split infinitives and cheap chrysanthemums. To put butter under the marmalade was to betray not only another hand, but another kind of mind. Dolly laughed. That is exactly like Lavinia. Murdered, and still censorious through breakfast. Miss Marple's needles clicked gently. Yes, she was not an easy woman. But then easy people seldom keep their houses, or their preserves, in such telling order. Outside the garden lay whitened and spare. A robin, absurdly bright against the snow, hopped upon the low wall beneath the window. Miss Marple watched it and thought, as she often did, how alike the human world remained beneath altered hats and newer motor cars. It reminds me, she said, of old Mrs. Simpkins in St. Mary Mead, who used to hide banknotes in jars of pickled walnuts because she said burglars never had patience with condiments. Her nephew was forever moving the pantry things to see whether she would notice. One day he upset more than he intended, and then all the family were astonished. They should not have been. Dolly looked at her over the teacups. Are people always so simple, Jane? Miss Marple considered. Not simple, repeated. Aye, that is different. There was, afterward, the small epilogue which villages insist upon. Ferny Court did not at once become a convalescent home or a nursing institution. Such transformations require committees, estimates, repairs, and men who come with ladders and measure windows incorrectly. But the intention stood. Lavinia Creswell, who had managed people badly in life, might perhaps do more good by arrangement after death. Cecily left Ferny Court in the spring and married Lionel quietly from the vicarage, without ornament and, Dolly said, with admirable sense. Beatrice remained on for a time to supervise alterations, and afterwards retired to a cottage with the sort of annuity that allows one to criticize tradesmen from a position of security. Vera Pritchard never again kept parish funds in her dressing table, but having discovered that disgrace is more tiring than honesty. Arthur Binns married the under-housemaid 2 years later, and became, against expectation, a decent greengrocer in Market Basing. As for Tibbs, he transferred his allegiance from the stillroom to the kitchen hearth, and grew so fat upon scraps and consequence that the village spoke of him with respect. One afternoon in early March, Miss Marple walked with Dolly past the gates of Ferny Court. The yews had been clipped. Workmen moved about the side lawn. From somewhere at the back came the sound of hammering and the faint, pleasant smell of oranges boiling. Dolly stopped. "Good gracious, they are making marmalade." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "Would you, after all that?" Miss Marple looked through the gate at the red brick house, quiet now beneath a pale sun. "My dear Dolly, one cannot surrender marmalade merely because it has once been mixed up with murder. If one did, there would be hardly any harmless things left." Dolly laughed in spite of herself. They walked on, their steps neat upon the gravel, while behind them Ferny Court settled slowly into its altered future. And Miss Marple, drawing her shawl a little closer against the wind, thought that wickedness was seldom grand. More often it began in the tiny pleasure of putting one's hand where it had no business to be, moving what was not one's to move, and watching others suffer the confusion. That was the root of it. Not hunger, not even greed, always, but the small private delight in meddling. At the corner by the churchyard wall, she paused to look at the first snowdrops lifting in the cold earth. "How very curious," she said softly, though no one had asked her anything at all. Then she went home to Dunmaid for tea.